Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward. Welcome to another episode of Emerging Biotech Leaders. I am your host, Ramin Farhood. Today's podcast is about how clinical operations bring science to life, turning research and discovery into data and data into therapy for patients. My guest is Sharon Arnold, a clinical operations leader and expert with over 20 years of experience across big biopharma and biotech. She began her career at Pfizer, contributing to multiple NDA filings before moving into the biotech world to build and lead clinical operation teams. She is currently Senior Vice President of Clinical Operations at Antos. In our conversation today with Sharon, we'll explore what it takes to lead clinical operations across different organizational contexts of all different sizes, the small and large, how to scale thoughtfully, and how emerging biotech leaders can use clinical ops as a strategic partner and a strategic lever and not just execution. Sharon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ramin. Delighted to be here. Thank you.
So Sharon, before we dive deeply into CleanOps, we'd like to hear from you and share your career journey from early days at Pfizer to where you are today. And how did you even choose CleanOps and how did that all come about?
So it's very, it's funny. A lot of people have a similar experience where you just sort of fall into a career. So I had been working in clinical cardiology for many years, done a variety of things there, mainly around cardiac care, but with electrophysiology and clinical studies in terms of TPA and sort of groundbreaking studies at that time. And I had a friend that said, hey, we need someone with arrhythmia experience. Would you be interested in coming over and working on a compound for a little while? It's going into phase 3. And I said, sure. When I did that, I really thought I was just leaving for a year, to get the product through FDA submission and approval. And then I'd be going back to clinical cardiology. And that product was Defitelio, which is Ticasin. It's used today in patients that have, I would say, heart pump issues and arrhythmia issues. It's very good. I happen to know a couple people actually in my life that are on it. So I'm proud to say that I worked on that. And then I happened to stay because they had another drug in a different therapeutic area that they said, hey, we need somebody with arrhythmia experience and then recent FDA experience. So would you come over and work on this? And so as everything happens at Pfizer, it evolved pretty quickly. And it was very compelling atmosphere, very dynamic, very global, and very scientifically oriented, which was really exciting for me. So then I stayed. And so my first job was in clinical operations, and that position sort of changed and morphed with clinical operations being a very dynamic organization that grew at Pfizer at that time to a very large global organization. And I was able to do a variety of things. I was never doing just one thing. Started out at that time as a CRA, went into study management, and then went into heading up groups that had recruitment and retention, predicting, enrollment forecasting, business operations, working with CROs, a whole variety of things. And then across a whole variety of therapeutic organizations. And so that's really what kept me at Pfizer for so long, was really it was really a great place to grow and to learn.
Excellent. And how did you make the transition, Sharon, from big company like Pfizer to a small biotech? What drove that decision? And also, what practices from big pharma did you find most useful to take with you with biotech, and what are some of the practices that you kind of had to leave behind and not necessarily apply to the smaller companies?
So I think for me, what was the best for me was to be in an environment where we were constantly growing, breaking new territory, and doing innovative things. Once clinical operations reached a point where we sort of were going back to the future a little bit, if you will, I decided that, and there was a reorg, that it was a good idea for me to go out and to try biotech and to really just have something different for a change. So that's really what motivated me to seek out biotech. And I did end up getting my first biotech job in an immuno-oncology therapeutic area, which is really important to me. I really had seen myself as doing a lot more in oncology than I did, even though cardiology is definitely a love of mine. And so it was an opportunity to sort of brush up on those skills. In terms of what you need, I think that, I can't speak for all other pharmas, but being in an organization that I was in where, we had BUs, we sort of had an in-source model at one point, we had a hybrid model, we had an fully outsourced resourcing model at another point. I sort of had the luxury of having all those experiences. And so I understood consultants and contractors and FSP models and all of that. And so I was pretty confident that I knew how to staff for the portfolio. And that's really what's key in terms of a biotech in clinical operations, is really understanding broadly what you'll need, sort of just-in-time staffing, what makes sense to hire as a permanent employee, what makes sense that a contractor or consultant would be able to do. Also sort of knowing what key roles are difficult to find. Mm-hmm. And so, if you find somebody that wants to be a permanent employee and it's a role that's very difficult to fill, then you may switch your strategy a little bit, be able to hire that person because they don't come along all that often. And I'll give you an example. So the clinical quality management portion of clinical operations is an area that I think is really important when you're going into phase 2, phase 2B, phase 3. You have your eye on submissions. And I think that those roles being embedded in the team are really key to helping the team solve for quality issues and understanding what they need to do or what's not necessary or anything like that. And those roles are hard to find. The clinical quality professionals are really difficult to find. If they have an area that they like, or if they have a company that they like, they don't tend to move around. Right. And so those roles are roles that if you find someone really great that you want, I would encourage people, if I were coaching them, to go ahead and hire that as a permanent employee. So those are some of the nuances that you have to think about. And then you have to think about your ultimate goal, right, which is a submission and to get approval for the drug. And so you're always thinking a little bit ahead as to which resources you might need and which resources should be in-house.
We're just going to ask along the same line. So what are some of those early signals that you look for to ramp up or scale up or outsource or insource? What are some of a couple of those signals that you look for to make those decisions?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important if you have a very large phase 2B or you're going into a larger phase 3 program that your sort of what I would call your nuts and bolts roles are your employees. And so I would say study management is very important. Oversight of the TMF is extremely important. And again, these roles are most likely overseeing a CRO. And so it's important that the sponsor has oversight of the work being performed at the CRO because they're doing it on behest of the sponsor. I also think that having an in-house statistician group is really important. They can augment with, there's some great FSPs out there for stats and small, what I would call small organizations for stats, but still having a core group that is in-house is really important. I think that data management is key to a successful submission. And so again, you can have the bulk of your data management within the CRO, but having a data management in-house group that helps to oversee the CRO and work very closely with, the clinical operations team. Maybe you have outsourced CRAs. Those roles, I think, are key for having, within your sponsor organization. Most recently in Anthos, which I should say is Anthos, a Novartis company, because we were acquired by Novartis in 2025. We did end up having some CRA oversight for the CRO, and they worked really well with the CRO. Sometimes the CRO themselves are stretched a little thin, and so trying to also get the same message to every individual line can be tricky. So having someone that works exclusively with their CRAs on your behalf is really helpful.
Wonderful. Clinical operations sometimes in general, and it could be just a misconception or misunderstanding of even the term operations, sometimes is viewed as execution only, right? And you get the clinical study, you get the protocol, and your job is to make sure you execute. Is that really true? Or is clinical ops a strategic partner, or is it more of execution? Is it 50-50, or how do you view that? What do you think is the most the optimal way of looking at a clinical operations?
Yeah, so I think, from my perspective, having a clinical operations as a strategic partner is really key. And what I mean by that is having them on the team as you're writing the protocol, having experienced clinical operations people review it that have experience in that particular therapeutic area. And it's okay if you don't have anyone on your team that has that immediate experience. You can always bring in a consultant or a contractor. But what you want to ensure is that your protocol is something that can be actually done by the outside world. So, we're not just looking at the tasks that need to be done by the patient or all the visits and things like that, that make it practical or slightly impractical. But we're also looking strategically, like, what are you hoping to get out of this protocol? What are your must-haves versus your nice-to-haves? And we need to really sometimes sort of push people to think about that, because anything that's overly complicated will sit at the bottom of somebody's pile. They're going to be enrolling the studies that are a little bit easier to do, that are clear, that the protocol is written very easily in terms of you can read it, you understand what's going on. Nobody wants to make a mistake with a patient. So it's really important. The protocol, I think, is really your blueprint. It's like building a house. If the blueprint is really confusing or not well laid out, then everything there doesn't go smoothly.
Right. It's been also same thing as you mentioned. It's been my experience that the clinical operations, it brings some reality into the protocol, right, and into the science. And that's why in my opening I was talking about how you really bring the science to life, right? Because the science may be great, but if the study is going to take 7 years to do, and you're going to have 18,000 patients, or it's going to be so many different nuances that sometimes on the clinical part, it may not be, very well thought through, just because the expertise may not be there, right? And I think that, especially in a smaller biotech, and I was going to ask also actually this question too, that I've noticed that sometimes the CEOs of the smaller biotech companies kind of don't quite understand that aspect of what clinical operations is, and they're really looking at it as the execution arm of the clinical development. Is that also been your experience, and how do you view that?
I think that in large pharma and in small biotech, it is a danger that clinical operations can look like a very transactional role. So all you have to do are, follow this checklist and then everything's done. But it really isn't. Most of the people that work in this area have had expertise for over 10 to 15 years. They know regulatory issues, rules, as well as the therapeutic area. They're very good at talking to the PIs when there's an issue, the study coordinator, you name it. They're not afraid to get on the phone and talk to the sites to find out what's happening. You need somebody that is really a professional, a seasoned professional, and really thinking about what they're doing and not just ticking the boxes. It's okay to have junior staff that you're bringing along, that we want that ideally. We want to grow our profession and make sure that there's always a pipeline of great motivated people. But you also need people that have been through several, maybe, have early development, late development, know what the FDA is looking for, stays current in what they're doing, and is really part of the larger team. And making sure that they're identifying potential pitfalls as you go along. So it's not a check the box exercise.
Right.
It's really looking at things a bit more holistically.
Right. And the more you're able to kind of look at across the enterprise, right, and kind of connect all the dots, and I think it's just it increases the probability of success, which is the filing the NDA and ultimately the approval as well. That's something that, if just throughout my experience, I've noticed that the great leaders and the CEOs and the people that are on the executive level that are kind of making big decisions, they're able to pull in all the different voices in drug development together and kind of hear everybody's different and unique perspective.
Right.
So we are all kind of marching on the same path. And I always felt like clinical operations is a little bit on the sideline, a little bit sometimes, but really the successful organizations and the successful NDA filing and ultimately the approval really holds true value of clinical operations. What are some of the core fundamentals that are not negotiable in clean ops?
Well, I think we talked about the clinical quality management role. I think for me, it's not enough just to have a QA department. That's important, and it's always important that we work and partner with quality assurance. But it's really important that we have a clinical quality management team that works within clinical operations and works on the team. Because those people are people that will get on, sort of knit together a sub-working group, for example, and say, hey, I heard this on the team. I want to explore, on one of the study team meetings, I want to explore this more fully. Can we get together with regulatory and stats and pull in a CRA and talk a little bit about whatever XYZ problem it is? And they're trying to keep the team, they're sort of like the canary in the coal mine, right? They're trying to keep the team abreast of whatever issue there could be before it becomes a larger issue. So I think that's really important from my perspective. Medical writing, I think, is also a key role that we haven't talked about. When we talk about the protocols being clear and being able to, be understood and being written in such a way that maybe you're using tables more than, having paragraphs of detailed information, you have to always think about the study coordinator and what's going on at the clinic, because if things are complicated, we know that clinics are really busy, and so we want to make sure that our protocols are clearly laid out. And a medical writer that has really good experience also knows regulatory issues, understands how things should be written, and can ensure that you have some sort of internal integrity written with your protocols, across protocols, and other documents that are super important when you're filing. And like I said, in terms of data management, they're also looking to ensure that the data's coming in, that there's some sort of a data review by the clinical team. And usually that's done with some sort of an interface with an application. And there's a number of them on the market now. Some have their own interface for clinical, but the data manager is really ensuring that, the CRO is adhering to timelines with the data, that they're able to, that their team, which would be clinical and others, are able to review the data, that if there's any data discrepancies, that those are being looked at in real time and remediated for. And so, it's sort of a living team environment where something is going on in every aspect of these roles at all times during the execution of the study, not just startup or closeout. And those things are really important, because I always say you really have to begin with the end in mind. And so, if you have good data with data integrity throughout, then when you're going for the filing, you're not going to have any major hiccups. So I think that, we've talked a lot about other roles. I also think that being able to have good working relationships with your other team members, whether they sit outside of clinical operations or not, such as clinical, regulatory, CMC, so we haven't talked at all about how vital and important it is to have within either clinical operations or within CMC a role that works with clinical operations really closely on getting drug supply to the sites, because without that, you're really not able to do much. If everything else is perfect, without the drug, you're not really able to go ahead with the protocol and enrolling patients. So those roles are super important. And some of them, I've worked in a model where they're within clinical operations, I've worked where they're not. It works. You just have to have a very collaborative environment, because it's all sort of like spinning plates, trying to keep everything going.
Right. Who's spinning it is not as important as making sure that the plates keep spinning, I guess. Right. Let's shift our conversation a little bit about M&A and integration dynamics. I know that you've been on both sides, being a big pharma acquiring small biotech companies, and also being a biotech getting acquired by big pharma. Tell us a little bit about your experience. How does that work, and what are some of the best lessons or practices, some of the mistakes that you've seen being made, or some of the best practices that people should be thinking about?
I think that on either side, whether you're the acquirer or you're someone that's being acquired, ensuring that you're both speaking the same language is really important. Okay. And so not being afraid to ask and probe, what do you mean by that? Because I think lots of times we assume, especially if you're in big pharma, that everybody has the same acronyms, that everybody thinks the same, and that is definitely not true. With my former employer, we ended up acquiring or merging with several large pharma companies, and everybody has their own spin on things. The nuts and bolts are the same, but the language can be different. And so I think that's one thing that I sort of was refreshed in my memory this past 2025, is just to make sure that you understand, what are you asking? What are you looking for? And again, all those basic project management things, like what's the date? When do you need this by? And just ensuring that your communication is clear, not being afraid to stop and ask. A lot of times people think, they won't know what I'm talking about. They'll think I don't know what I'm talking about, but that's really not the issue. When you're merging or acquiring, you're on two different planets and you're trying to bring them into one. Right. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is being on the end of the smaller biotech, is that I was not surprised, but it's sort of went like a light bulb for me. We had SOPs for sure. We had a very dynamic group at Anthos, and people were writing SOPs and very aware of that between our group and the QA group. But I was surprised at how many more that our acquiring companies still wanted us to go ahead and write and have for us until they officially retired clinical operations. Right. So I would say that a lot of times people think, you don't need this SOP or you don't need that SOP, and they sort of try to get by on bare bones. And when you're the acquiring company, you actually will want them to run sort of their own group until you have a QMS switchover. And that's a big deal nowadays. And so they will encourage you to please go ahead and write those SOPs. So I would say to a small biotech company, getting your SOPs straight and fit for purpose for whatever phase 3, phase 2B, whatever you're doing, you can't overdo it, because you would be surprised at how long you're going to be operating in your SOPs, longer than you think. So that's something that I think people sort of forget about or think they don't need.
Right. I mean, the communication that you bring up it's really the key, right? Yeah. And both sides assume that the other side knows what's going on, and we are talking the same language, and even the goals immediately changes,
Right.
right? Right at
That's
the
right.
time that you get acquired, whether you're getting acquired or you're acquiring a company, right?
Right.
There's a
Right.
bigger goal in
Exactly.
place, that's the reason you got acquired, or that's the reason that you're being acquired. And even shifting kind of overnight, even though sometimes it says business as usual, and it is, right?
Correct.
It is
Yes.
business as usual, but sometimes that changes overnight, and
It
we're
does.
not exactly as employees quite ready for that to change in a matter of a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and that's also sometimes it's a little bit challenging for folks.
It is. I think the thing to remember, and this is what I talk to my folks about quite a bit, is that we're juggling one typically. I mean, at least in a small biotech, you may have more than one compound, but you're not going to have a huge portfolio for sure. You're going to have a typical, 1 to 3 compounds, and they're juggling, 4 times, 5 times that. And so they're trying to work with you around their day job. And so I think sometimes people, don't understand why, we have to keep telling them the same thing. Well, it's because, we're just one small piece in a larger portfolio.
Right.
What I like to do is to ensure that we're giving them written documentation, so it's great to communicate and have meetings, but you always need to follow it up with, some form of communication that they can refer back to. Typically slides work really well, getting yourself a SharePoint space where you have it for the acquisition. And so because you're going to have pre-acquisition spaces where you may have your due diligence and things like that, but you're going to find that you're going to need a lot of that same material post-acquisition or some new material that you're creating for them. And so it's really important to have a space to be able to put that so that they can refer back to that instead of asking you all the time. You've got it there for them. And so those are some of the agreements that are really helpful to get up, sort of squared away up front.
To have in place. Absolutely. Let's shift our conversation a little bit about the future and the trends. Where do you see the future trends in cleanups? Where are we going? Where's cleanups going to be in maybe 10 years from now, 5 years, 2030, 2035? What are some of the things that you think is shifting?
So I think, I'll just start with just, in sort of the immediate, there's a lot of discussion around AI. And I think there's a lot of excitement and there's a lot of feeling, especially with, I would say, maybe very senior levels that, this is going to help us and be able to make our job a lot easier. And I think that with AI, there are aspects of, data mining, and I'm thinking about maybe site selection. I'm thinking about maybe enrollment data in terms of, how fast a particular trial may go, or I'm thinking about where, patients might be for a particular therapeutic area and indication. However, what I would caution people about is thinking that we don't have to really vet that data extremely carefully. And I'm not going to give all the details, but we did have an experience where we were working with a very well-known and great firm that is a consulting firm, and they were using sort of the latest. I'm not saying they used AI, but they were using sort of the latest data. And then when we started asking questions, and it was to do feasibility, right? So in feasibility, you're doing all of that at once, right? You're trying to figure out where are the patients, where are the PIs, who can run this study, what's the competition? Because just because of, you find the patients and you find the PI, they also may have a lot of other studies going on in the same indication. And so you may be later rather than sooner to their desk. So all of those things have to happen at once. And then we realized in our conversation as we sort of, went along, and again, we were lucky that we were having very transparent conversations and we were pressure testing our assumptions against their assumptions. And one of, sort of their tenets was about a study that had, started up and then closed down. And we had to, get our experts on the call and say, no, here are the subtle nuances that make ours totally different from them, and probably why not all, but the bulk of those sites may not work for us, and here's why. So I think that AI will be helpful in, mining large streams of data, if you will. But I always think that you're going to need people on either end of it to discuss the assumptions. And you're going to need people that have expertise in those fields, especially on the sponsor side, to be able to really, drive those discussions. And you can't really take something at face value just because it sounds good. So I think that is something that, over the next 5 years, I think people are going to have to be aware of, and people are going to have to make sure that they're really interrogating and pressure testing the data that they're getting back.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about patient diversity in 5 years, 10 years from now? It feels like in the past 20 years that patient diversity is becoming more and more critical for the success of the NDA filing and ultimately approval, and we're on that trend. What are some of your thoughts around that?
I think patient diversity is huge. And when I started at Pfizer, we were very concerned about it, and Pfizer did start a group really to look at that, and how do we ensure that we have patient diversity so that we know how a particular drug is acting, if you will, in all different types of people. That's super important. What I think is really important is to be partnering with universities, medical schools. I think that diversity starts with your PI, because I think that patients like to go to physicians if they have the opportunity that they feel like they possibly have something in common with. If it, I'm just going to speak freely. Sometimes for certain things, I like to go to a female physician for certain reasons. So people, because people like to have sort of that, to know that your physician sort of knows what you're going through a little bit, or what you may have gone through. And so I think that that's really important. And so I think that small biotech can think about that. They don't typically have the funds that a larger biotech would have, but I think you have to really start in getting physicians, researchers excited about research in general, so that they understand what are clinical trials. What does the pharmaceutical company do to, how difficult or arduous is it to get a drug across the finish line? What goes into it? Because I think that a couple of reasons. Number one, in this environment, I think they'll be better able to handle the questions that they're getting from their patients about, medications, vaccines, whatever it is. They'll be better able to, and better equipped to be able to handle those questions and conversations. And I think also, in order to diversify our patient population pool, we really have to be able to diversify our PI pool and make sure, within each country, we're able to maximize the amount of information that we can understand how the drug acts in our patients as a whole. Again, holistically looking at that. So I think that that's extremely important. And I'm hoping that what I really think is key is a partnership with the PI, not just, generating data that you can say, oh, well, this is where this, type of patient lives. And, no, that's not key. What's key is the PI relationship, and the PI relationship with the patient, because they are better equipped to know who would benefit from a particular study.
Right. The patient voice as well. Patient voice early on into clinical operations. And that's another thing that sometimes we don't think about. We think of patient journey and patient voice maybe in clinical development and the protocol, right? If the company is really good and they're thinking ahead and they're forward thinking, they think about that voice and bring in that insights into the protocol. But once it gets to the execution, right, and clinical operations, we kind of forget about that voice, that we continuously need that perspective to have a successful trial.
We do. My first company with immuno-oncology, I was able to get a patient advocacy group for oncology in the U.S. involved. And they were very excited about, they represent patients in clinical trials, in oncology, and, happy to collaborate with sponsors from the beginning to your point, prior to writing the protocol, but also during the whole patient journey with recruitment, retention, and be able to connect sponsors with appropriate PIs if possible. And I think that's really important. I also think that writing a protocol or an informed consent in a way that a patient's able to understand it, and there are some niche vendors out there, large pharma will have this already, but niche vendors out there that are able to take your informed consent and be able to help you with different tools so that you can break down the consent, or maybe not break it down, but, give other aids for the patient so that they understand what their trial is all about more easily. Some of the consents tend to be, longer, and I know we're always working on making them shorter. There are reasons for them to be longer. And so I think it's important to be able to make everything as transparent as possible. And patient advocacy groups can help with all of that.
Right. I like what you said about having the end in mind. At the end, we want the product to be approved for the patients.
Exactly.
Right. They're going to be the end user, and everybody else is kind of in between. Right.
Right.
And it's really, really important to kind of have their perspective and involvement and advocacy groups as well. Yes. Very, very early on. It also helps with the patient recruitment, what type of patient you can join the studies, because the patients also have to go through a lot of different challenges to get to a study, even if they do get accepted and included and enrolled in the study as well. I think that's a great insight that you bring up. In closing, Sharon, I want to talk about the leadership and the leadership lessons. One is that, what is the biggest leadership lesson that you have learned throughout your career that you want to pass on and share with the emerging biotech executives?
So I think that what I would say is, I think a global group, for clinical operations is really key. I've always said that we really want to get the best and the brightest. And if possible, expand outside of the US for your team building, to build your team. Sometimes it's possible. Sometimes you have to look into other things such as employer of record, or, whatever you can do in each country to be able to do that. Or there are some challenges and hurdles, but I think that we should think about our teams broadly so that we're ensuring that we get the best and the brightest. I think the second thing is that even if you're managing a workforce that is remote at times, I think that what's key from my perspective is making sure that everybody checks in with everybody. So if I have somebody that's in the UK, I'm getting on, checking my email, I'll query for that person right away to see if they had something, because they're 5 or 6 hours ahead of me. Did they need something right away, that I can jump on? Or if nothing, then I'll make sure I'm like, hey, how's it going? Reach out, touch base. I think that those things are really important when you're managing a global remote work team, or even if you're managing a remote work team here in the US, you have to be sort of touching in with people, even if it's just a quick chat on IM. Virtual coffees are a lot of things that I've done because I find that people are more relaxed. It's just 15 minutes. How's it going? Anything I should be aware of? Those are really helpful. I also think that there's more to clinical operations than enrollment. I realize that, enrollment is super important, and that in a small biotech, it's the lifeline really of what we're doing. But I do think that we have other considerations such as safety, quality, data integrity. We have to make sure that we're looking at everything holistically, as we talked about earlier. And I think that mentoring people and bringing people along is really important. I think that people have to be motivated. People have to really understand why they're on this journey with you, why it's important, why it's you're asking them to do certain things. I think town halls are good, but I think having smaller focus groups are better.
Like coffee chats and more of a smaller, more intimate setting. Sometimes the town halls can be very intimidating, even if it's 20 or 30 or 40 people, right? I'm not talking about thousands like a bigger pharma. It could be very intimidating to ask a question. You're always thinking about, well, maybe this question has already been answered. Maybe it's not appropriate. Maybe it's a stupid question to ask. Maybe everybody else knows the answer except me. And I really like what you say about more intimate settings, each of the functions.
Exactly. If they're looking for feedback, I think they're more likely to get feedback in smaller settings. I also think that with a remote group, because a lot of it is remote, even though you may have a hybrid workforce, some may be on site, some may be remote, bringing everybody in quarterly and having that face-to-face with everybody is really helpful and sort of course corrects, what did we do last quarter that we think we could have done better? What are we going to do next quarter? What are our priorities? I like to ensure that people are starting off every week with the priorities. What are, especially if you've got layers of management, everyone's sort of marching in the same step in terms of what are the priorities. Everybody's clear on that. I've known that for people that are on site, it is helpful to have, a get together, whether that's a lunch once a week or something like that. Why come into the office? People want to know that. So there, all of these things are sort of tips and tricks to try to bring the workforce together, so that we're not just wondering, okay, I could do this anywhere. Why am I doing it here? Yeah.
Right. It kind of takes I think the why really helps to take the transactional aspect of what we do day to day out of it, right, and make it a lot more meaningful. And because of that, we are willing to give a lot more of ourselves, and it doesn't feel like this is just a job. This is something I just have to do. And sometimes I don't even know I have to do it. I don't care because I just have to do it because my boss wants it. But that why, I think, helps quite a bit to get people engaged and involved with the organization.
And I always have to remind people that top talent always has options. So you can't take your high performers for granted. And, you have to always be looking for ways to work with them, motivate them, and give them what they need to keep going.
What would be your advice for somebody who wants to get to clinical operations? Somebody maybe early on in their career and they're kind of thinking about, what do I do? Maybe they're already in a biotech or big pharma and they're considering to go to clinical ops. What are some of the advice that you have for them?
So I think that in a larger pharma, you're going to have a lot of opportunities, right? They have all different roles from study management to site engagement, which I think we did with our last program. And it was a great role in terms of, working with CRAs and clinicians to, make sure your sites are engaged and all sorts of things depending upon the indication. I think that would be a great way to get in. I think if you're struggling to get into big pharma, then, by all means, think about becoming a CRA. And, many CROs have great training programs. I always encourage people to find out what is the training program, because that's what you want. You want to make sure that you're getting, you're not just transactional, right? You're not just sent out to a site and given 1,000 sites and you really don't know what you're doing. What's the training? How long does it last? What are the opportunities there? I think CROs can help you to make the jump into that. I think small biotech is helpful in that you can learn a lot of different roles, but I think you need to remember you always need to have a really good foundation. And so what is that foundation? Are you going to go into data management? You're going to go into pharmaceutical safety, which I think is a great role that can do, kind of move around. Are you going to go into regulatory, another exciting field? So I think there's plenty of fields, and there are opportunities at some universities. They will have pharmaceutical sciences where you can sort of take some courses, explore what that's all about, explore what some of these different roles do. And then by all means, talk to people. We're all on LinkedIn and we're happy to mentor and share our learnings with anybody.
Right. I mean, laying out, I think what you're speaking to is kind of laying out that roadmap of what your career could look like, even though you may not be 100% sure where you want to end up in 5 years from now, but at least looking at everything in totality as opposed to just taking one path and not looking at other possibilities that may exist out there, especially for cleanups. There's so many different avenues that you can take that ultimately will take you to where you are today if your goal is to head a clinical operations organization.
That's right.
Yes. So, well, Sharon, thank you so much for joining us today. I think you're sharing with us your knowledge, expertise, your insights. It's been fantastic. I think one of the things, there are a few things that stands out for me. One is that clinical operations is really a strategic partner, and if it's done right, if it's led well, it can really make it or break it for a successful therapy coming to the market. The other thing that I can think about going back in the past 40 minutes that we've been having this conversation is communication.
Yes.
Communication, even over communicating is better than not communicating or you're communicating a little bit, which is so critical to bring everybody along and making sure that they're engaged and they have the clarity, even though there may be a lot of ambiguity around the data or around the study, but at least they have clarity around the mission and why we're doing what we're doing. Again, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate your time here, and thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.